I know the difference between a foundation that holds and one that's been rotting from the inside for years. I spent 34 years as a structural engineer. I have walked across bridges in January wind that would knock most men sideways, checked load calculations at 2 in the morning, driven 3 hours to a job site because someone reported a hairline crack in a support beam. I know how things fail. I know the signs. And I know that when something finally gives way, it almost never surprises you. Not really, not if you've been paying attention. The thing is, I wasn't paying attention. Not at home. My name is Walter. No, wait. I need a different name for this. One that isn't mine yet. Feels like it fits the weight of what I'm about to tell you. Call me Gene. Eugene was my father's name, and my father was a man who worked until his hands were raw and never once asked to be thanked for it. That's about right. I am 63 years old. I lived in a 4-bedroom house outside of Columbus, Ohio. The kind of neighborhood where the lawns are kept and the driveways have basketball hoops that nobody uses anymore. I retired 14 months before any of this happened. Full pension, good health, a savings account that I've been careful with for decades. My wife of 31 years, Miriam, had passed 2 years prior. Pancreatic cancer. 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end. I don't talk about that part much. Some things you carry without putting them into words. After she was gone, it was just me and the house, and my daughter, Petra, who lived 40 minutes away in Westerville with her husband, a man named Cliff, and their 2 kids. I had a son, too, older, Thomas, who lived in Denver with his wife, Alicia. We talked every few weeks. It was fine. It was the kind of fine that you tell yourself is enough, because you don't want to examine it too closely. Petra was the one I was close to. Or thought I was. She called every Sunday. She brought the grandkids over for birthdays. She was the one who sat with me in the hospital during the weeks with Miriam. She held my hand in the parking garage afterward and didn't say anything, which was exactly right. I thought I knew who she was. I thought I had built something real with her. Cliff, I never fully trusted, but I kept that to myself. He had the kind of easy confidence that comes from never having had to build anything from scratch. He worked in pharmaceutical sales, made decent money, spent more than he made, and had a way of talking about investments he'd looked into that made me want to change the subject. He was charming at Thanksgiving. He remembered birthdays. He called me Gene when Petra wasn't in the room, which I didn't like but never said. About 18 months after Miriam passed, Petra and Cliff started coming around more. Not just Sunday calls, actual visits, weeknight dinners, Cliff suggesting we watch football together. At first I was grateful. I was lonely. A man can admit that. A 61-year-old widower sitting in a 4-bedroom house with a dog who had also recently died is not a man who turns away company. Then the asks started. Small ones first. Cliff needed help covering a cash flow issue for 2 weeks, $3,000, back by the end of the month. It came back. Then a bigger one. They wanted to refinish their basement, turn it into something nice for the kids. Did I want to contribute since I'd be using it too? I wrote the check. Then the car. Petra's SUV had been giving her trouble, and they'd found a good deal on a lease but needed help with the down payment. $8,000. I wrote that check too. I want to be clear, I wasn't blind. I saw the pattern. But Petra was my daughter, and she had sat with me in that parking garage, and I told myself that money is just money. You can't take it with you. Better she has it now than after. That's what I told myself. Last March, I had a routine stress test. My cardiologist likes to run one every 2 years since I turned 60. Came back with something he didn't like. A blockage, partial in one of the coronary arteries. Not an emergency, he said, but not nothing. He scheduled me for a cardiac catheterization at Riverside Methodist, the procedure where they go in and either confirm the blockage or deal with it right there, depending on what they find. I told Petra about it the week before. She said, "Dad, do you want me to come?" And I said, "Of course not. It was outpatient. I'd drive myself home. It was nothing to worry about." She said, "Okay." She didn't push. What I didn't tell her, what I didn't tell anyone, was that my cardiologist had been more cautious in his language than I first let on. The words he used were potentially significant. He wanted me to have someone with me. I didn't arrange that. I'm not sure why. Maybe I was still used to handling things alone. Maybe I didn't want to make a fuss. The procedure was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at 7. I checked in, changed into the gown, spoke to the anesthesiologist. The last thing I remember before the sedation was a nurse asking me if I had family on the way. I told her I was fine. I was not fine. What happened during the procedure, I only know this from the doctor's account afterward, is that they found not one blockage, but two, and that during the intervention, my heart went into what they call ventricular fibrillation. Not a full cardiac arrest, but close enough that they had to use the defibrillator, administer additional medication, and bring in a second cardiologist on call. It lasted, by the clock, about 4 minutes. 4 minutes where my heart was doing something it was not supposed to do. I woke up in the cardiac ICU. There was a nurse checking my IV line. The ceiling tiles were those old drop ceiling panels you see in every hospital in America. I had a tube in my wrist and leads on my chest and the sound of a monitor beeping steady and slow. I asked what had happened. She explained it to me in the careful, measured way that nurses explain difficult things when they don't want to alarm you. She told me they had called my emergency contact. I had listed Petra. I asked if she had come. The nurse paused before she answered. Just a small pause, the kind that tells you everything. She said she would try to come by later, the nurse said. I closed my eyes. It was 11:15 in the morning on a Tuesday. Petra didn't have a job outside the house. The kids were in school. Westerville was 40 minutes away. And she had said she would try to come by later. I didn't say anything. I stared at the ceiling tiles and breathed through the feeling that was sitting in the middle of my chest. And it wasn't the catheterization. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, nobody had come. I asked a different nurse, an older woman with a no-nonsense manner I appreciated, whether anyone had called again to check. She told me yes. They had phoned my emergency contact a second time when it became clear I'd be staying overnight. She looked at me steadily when she told me what my daughter had said. Petra had told them that she was in the middle of something and couldn't get away, and that if the situation was truly critical, they should let her know, but otherwise she would plan to visit the following day. The situation was truly critical. I had been defibrillated on a table 3 hours earlier. The nurse didn't editorialize. She just told me, and then she checked my pulse, and then she left the room. I spent that night alone. Thomas called at 7 that evening after Petra had apparently texted him. He said the right things. He offered to fly out. I told him not to, that I was stable, that it was over. I don't know why I protected him from the full weight of it. Maybe because he was already far away and I didn't want to make it worse. Maybe I wasn't ready to admit what I was starting to understand. Petra came the next afternoon. She brought flowers, the kind you grab at a grocery store on the way somewhere. She kissed me on the forehead and said she'd been so worried, and she'd wanted to come yesterday. But the timing had just been, and here she used the word crazy. The timing had just been crazy. I asked her what had made it crazy. She said Cliff's company had been doing a big regional event, a team dinner at the steakhouse downtown, and she'd had to be there for that, a team dinner. I had been defibrillated on a table, and she had been at the team dinner at the steakhouse. I didn't say any of this out loud. I looked at the flowers in the plastic sleeve, the kind where you can see the barcode sticker from the grocery store checkout, and I said thank you for coming. She stayed for 45 minutes. She hugged me carefully on the way out, said the kids sent their love, and left. I lay there for a long time after she left. Here is something they don't tell you about being in a cardiac ICU. You have nothing to do but think. No work, no errands, no television that holds your interest for more than 10 minutes. Just the monitor and the ceiling and the quiet. And I used that time. I thought about the $3,000 that came back, and the $8,000 that didn't, and the $15,000 I'd transferred the previous November to help them get through the holidays. I thought about every time Cliff had called me Jean when Petra wasn't listening. I thought about a conversation I'd had with Thomas 4 months earlier when he'd mentioned, casually, that Cliff had told him I was planning to update my estate plan to reflect the current family situation. I hadn't told anyone that. I hadn't done that. I thought about how Petra had known about my procedure and had not arranged to be there. I thought about a team dinner at a steakhouse, and I started to understand that what I had taken for closeness had been proximity to a resource. I had been useful, and somewhere along the way I had confused being needed with being loved. I was discharged 4 days after the procedure. Strict instructions, no driving for 2 weeks, light activity only, follow-up appointment in 10 days. The hospital arranged a medical transport. Petra had offered to pick me up and then called that morning to say Cliff had a work conflict and she needed the car. She suggested I take an Uber. I was 63 years old and had been in the cardiac ICU 4 days earlier, and she suggested I take an Uber. I took the medical transport. I went home. And I made a decision. I didn't make it in anger. That's the part I want you to understand. I wasn't furious. I was calm in the way that a man gets calm when the last piece falls into place and he finally sees the whole picture clearly. I had been a structural engineer for 34 years. I knew how to assess damage. I knew what could be repaired and what had to be torn down and rebuilt from nothing. Some structures can be reinforced, others are compromised at the load-bearing level, and no amount of surface repair will change that. What was compromised was not something I had built. It had been built around me, without my knowledge, while I was grieving and lonely and writing checks. I called my attorney first. His name isn't important. He'd been my attorney for 20 years, handled the estate when Miriam passed, knew my finances top to bottom. I told him I wanted to review and revise my will. Completely. He asked if everything was all right. I told him it would be. I also called my financial advisor. I had a brokerage account, a pension, Social Security, and savings. All told, enough to live comfortably for the rest of my life without touching the principal. I asked him to help me move certain assets into structures that were cleaner, harder to contest, and fully in my control. He asked questions. I answered them. We spent 2 full afternoons on it. By the end, my estate was restructured in a way that was legal, documented, and would be very difficult for anyone to challenge. Thomas, I called on a Sunday morning, 2 weeks after I got home. I told him the full story, the procedure, the phone calls, the team dinner, the Uber. He was quiet for a long time after. He said, "Dad, I didn't know it was that bad." I believed him. I told him what I was planning to do, not the financial details, but the essential shape of it. He said he understood. He said he was sorry he hadn't been there. I told him the truth. I didn't blame him for not being there. I blamed the silence that had let me believe things were better than they were. He offered again to fly out. This time I said yes. He spent a long weekend in Columbus. We drove out to Hocking Hills, walked some of the trail slowly because I was still under restrictions. We ate breakfast at a diner outside of Logan and drank bad coffee and talked more honestly than we had in years. It wasn't a repair, exactly. It was a beginning. "That's not nothing," Petra called during that time. I answered. She talked about the kids, about Cliff's next quarterly bonus, about a kitchen renovation they were considering. She did not ask about my health beyond a single "how are you feeling" at the start of the call. I said fine. I let her talk. I listened to the way she talked. What I heard was a person who had decided at some level she may not have been fully conscious of that I was a permanent fixture, that I would always be there, that the account would always be there, that the account would always be there, that the house would always be there, that whatever she and Cliff needed, I would provide, because that was the established pattern, and patterns continue until something disrupts them. I was going to be the disruption. 6 weeks after discharge, my attorney had the new documents ready. I reviewed them carefully. I made one additional change I want to mention. I set up a trust for my grandchildren's education, Petra's kids, that would pay directly to accredited institutions and could not be accessed by their parents for any other purpose. I did that because I love those children, and none of what their father and mother had done was their fault. That was the one thing I was certain of. Everything else went elsewhere, to a list of charitable organizations I had been involved with over the years, to Thomas and Alicia, to a colleague's scholarship fund at Ohio State. Specific, documented, witnessed, filed. I also did something I'd been thinking about since that first night alone in the ICU. I called a realtor. Miriam and I had talked, before she got sick, about retiring somewhere warmer. She'd always liked the coast of South Carolina, the actual coast, not Myrtle Beach, the quieter parts. We'd driven through Beaufort once on a road trip and she'd said, "Gene, if we ever get out of Ohio, it's somewhere like this." I'd nodded and kept driving and let the years go by and never done a thing about it. I put the Columbus house on the market in October. I pressed it to sell. It sold in 11 days. I didn't tell Petra until I had a signed purchase agreement on a house in a small community outside of Beaufort. 3 bedrooms, single story, a screened porch that faced west, a dock on a tidal creek. I told her over the phone on a Thursday evening. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're moving?" I said yes. "When?" "January." Another silence. Then, "Dad, we should talk about this. This seems really sudden. We're here. The grandkids are here." I said, "I know." She said, "And you're selling the house?" "Our house?" "The house we grew up in." "Where, Mom?" I said, "Petra. I almost died in March. I lay in the hospital for 4 days. You came on the second day for 45 minutes and then you left. I needed you and you weren't there. I have been thinking about this for months. I am not asking for permission." The silence this time was different. Longer. I could hear her breathing. She started to explain. The dinner, the timing, how she hadn't fully understood how serious it was, how she would have come if she'd known. I said, "They called you twice. They told you it was serious. You already knew." She said, "Gene, Dad, I think you're not seeing this clearly. I think you're making a decision from a place of." I said, "I'm making a decision from the clearest place I've been in years. I love you. I love the kids. And I am going." I moved to South Carolina in the second week of January. The new house smelled like cedar and salt water when I first walked in with the keys. I stood in the empty living room for a while before I unloaded anything. There is a thing that happens when you stand in an empty room that you chose, that belongs to you, that no one has any claim on. A kind of quiet that isn't loneliness. I hadn't felt that in a long time. Thomas and Alicia flew in to help me move. We rented a truck and drove down from Columbus in 2 days, stopping overnight in Knoxville, eating barbecue in a place with picnic tables and paper towels for napkins, It was the best meal I'd had in months. It probably says something that I remember it that clearly. Cliff called twice that week. I let it go to voicemail. He did not leave a message either time. Petra texted. I read the texts. I didn't answer all of them, not right away. I was setting up the screened porch the way I wanted it, buying a kayak I'd had on my mind for 3 years, going to sleep early and waking up when I woke up, and not answering to anything I didn't want to answer to. In April, Petra and Cliff drove down to see me. I agreed to it. I cooked a proper meal, the way Miriam had taught me, the kind of dinner that takes all afternoon. The kids were not with them, which I'd expected. We ate on the screened porch. It was a warm evening. The creek was high. There was a great blue heron standing at the edge of the water, the way they do, entirely still, waiting. After dinner, Cliff brought up the estate. He did it carefully, in the manner of someone who has rehearsed. He said they'd heard from the attorney, my attorney, whom they'd apparently contacted, that the will had been revised. He said he just wanted to understand the thinking. He was calm about it, reasonable sounding. I told him the thinking was simple. I had revised my estate to reflect the current family situation. I looked at him when I said it, and I used exactly the phrase he had used with Thomas, 4 months before my procedure. The phrase he had used when he apparently assumed I was moving toward a conclusion that would benefit him. He understood what I meant. I could see it on his face. He said, that's your right, obviously. I said, yes, it is. Petra said very little. She looked out at the water. The heron lifted off eventually, great gray wings opening, and was gone. They drove back the next morning. I don't know what comes next between me and my daughter, honestly. I hope something. I hope that she finds her way back to being the person who sat with me in that parking garage and said nothing, because nothing was the right thing to say. I think that person is still in there somewhere. I think what grew up around her, the house, the renovation, the quarterly bonuses, the team dinners, I think that obscured her, the way renovation work sometimes obscures the original structure. Whether it can be uncovered, I don't know. That's her work to do, not mine. What I know is this: I am 63 years old, and I live in a house on a tidal creek in South Carolina, and I drink my coffee on a screened porch in the morning, and the only sound is the water and the birds. I kayak 3 times a week. My heart is monitored carefully and is, according to my new cardiologist here in Beaufort, doing exactly what we want it to do. I have Thomas's number in my phone, and he calls on Sundays, reliably. And we talk about football and his kids, and sometimes about Miriam, and that is enough. I wasted a lot of years being a foundation that let other people build on top of me without ever asking what I needed. I'm done with that now. The structure I'm building now is for me, and it is, for the first time in longer than I can remember, exactly as sound as I know how to make it. There's a specific kind of quiet that comes after you finally stop waiting for someone to show up. Not the painful quiet, the clear one. I found it on a screened porch in South Carolina, watching a great blue heron stand motionless at the edge of a tidal creek, and I thought, that bird knows exactly what it's doing. It doesn't chase, it doesn't call out, it just waits for the right moment, and then it moves. I spent a long time being the wrong kind of patient. What happened to me? To Petra, to Cliff, to the version of our family I'd been protecting in my head long after the real one had already hollowed out, wasn't bad luck. It was the result of choices, accumulated slowly, one check at a time, one unanswered call at a time, one team dinner at a time. Cause and effect doesn't announce itself. It just builds quietly, the way water finds the crack in a foundation and widens it over years until the morning you wake up and the whole thing shifts. I made choices too. I chose to confuse need with love. I chose to confuse need with love. I chose to keep writing checks because it was easier than asking hard questions. I chose to tell myself that proximity was the same as closeness, that because Petra called on Sundays, she must have meant it. Those were my choices. I owned them, and they cost me 4 nights alone in a cardiac ICU, which is a steep price for avoiding an honest conversation. Here's what I learned about character. Real character. Not the kind people perform at Thanksgiving. It shows up in the moments that cost something. Petra had a chance to show me who she was when the stakes were actual, not hypothetical, not a favor that could be returned later. I was on a table and my heart had stopped doing what hearts are supposed to do, and she was at a steakhouse. That's information. It's painful information, but it's honest, and I've learned to be grateful for honesty even when it arrives in a form I didn't want. And Cliff, I don't carry anger toward him either. A man who tells you, son, that your estate plan is moving in a good direction before you've discussed it with anyone. A man who calls you by your first name when your daughter leaves the room. That man has shown you his calculation. You can work with a known quantity. What breaks you is the one you didn't see coming. Thomas surprised me. That's the part of this story I don't want to skip over. He drove with me through Tennessee, ate bad diner food, walked slowly with me through the hills because I was still under restrictions and didn't push the pace. He called on Sundays and kept calling. I think for years I had unconsciously written him off as the distant one, the one who got away, and what I missed was that distance and absence are not the same thing. He was never absent. I just wasn't paying attention. That's the one thing I'd want anyone to take from what I've been through. Pay attention, not to what people say, to what they do when it costs them something to do the right thing. And pay attention to yourself. I was so busy being a foundation for everyone else that I forgot to check my own load-bearing walls. The honest self-examination. The hard look at what's actually true versus what you've decided to believe. That's not cruelty. That's the most important work a person can do. I'm 63 years old and my heart is being monitored carefully and is doing exactly what we want it to do. I kayak 3 times a week. I drink my coffee in the morning and watch the water, and I don't owe anyone an explanation for any of it. That's not bitterness. That's what it feels like to finally be standing on solid ground.